23rd of May, 1944. Salle des Fêtes, Avenue Foch, Paris. The electric bulb swung gently from the ceiling, casting shadows across the blood-stained floor. Violette Szabo could no longer feel her feet. The German interrogator, Sturmbannführer Hans Kiefer, leaned forward, his voice almost gentle as he asked the question for the 100th time. "Just give us one name, Madame Szabo. One name, and this ends." The 23-year-old Londoner raised her head, blood trickling from her split lip. Through swollen eyes, she fixed the Gestapo officer with a stare that had not wavered in 3 days of interrogation. Her answer, delivered in French with a distinct Brixton accent, was the same as before. "Je ne sais rien." I know nothing. What Kiefer did not know was that Violette Szabo knew everything. She knew the names of 37 resistance fighters in the Limoges network. She knew the locations of weapons caches containing over 3,000 Sten guns. She knew the safe houses, the radio frequencies, the drop zones, and the escape routes. She knew the real identities of a dozen British agents operating across France, and she would die before revealing any of it. Violette Szabo was one of 50 British women sent into Nazi-occupied Europe by a secret organization so classified that even Parliament did not know the full scope of its operations. They were trained in sabotage, silent killing, parachute drops, and codes. They were given cyanide pills and false identities. Then they were sent into the most dangerous territory in the world, with life expectancies measured in weeks. 13 of these women would never return home. Their stories of courage, sacrifice, and unflinching determination in the face of torture and death represent some of the most extraordinary acts of heroism in British military history. Yet for decades after the war, their service remained classified, their sacrifices unrecognized, their names erased from official records. This is the story of the women Churchill sent to die, and why they went willingly. The birth of Britain's secret army began in the summer of 1940. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk. Nazi Germany controlled the entire European coastline, from Norway to Spain. Britain stood alone, facing an enemy that possessed overwhelming military superiority and appeared unstoppable. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood that conventional military operations could not defeat Germany alone. Britain needed intelligence from occupied Europe. It needed resistance movements to tie down German troops. It needed sabotage operations to disrupt enemy production. Most importantly, it needed hope, both for the occupied peoples and for the British public. On the 22nd of July, 1940, Churchill issued a directive that would change the nature of modern warfare. He ordered the creation of an organization to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and the organization of resistance movements. This organization, officially designated as the Special Operations Executive, would become one of the most effective intelligence services of the Second World War. The SOE operated outside conventional military structures. It reported directly to the Minister of Economic Warfare, technically a civilian position. This arrangement gave the organization freedom from normal military regulations and allowed it to conduct operations that regular forces could not or would not attempt. The SOE could forge documents, conduct assassinations, bribe officials, and violate every conventional rule of warfare. But the SOE faced an immediate problem. It needed agents who could blend seamlessly into occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other territories. These agents needed to speak the local languages perfectly, understand local customs intimately, and operate independently for months without support. They needed courage, intelligence, and the ability to withstand interrogation if captured. In 1941, someone within the SOE suggested what was then considered a radical idea. Women could serve as field agents in occupied territory. The suggestion met immediate resistance. The very notion of sending women into combat zones violated every military tradition. Women served as nurses, clerks, and support staff. They did not parachute behind enemy lines to conduct sabotage and espionage. But the practical arguments in favor of female agents were compelling. Women moving through occupied France attracted less suspicion than men of military age. The Germans expected male agents and watched for them carefully. Women could travel more freely, carry messages, transport weapons, and conduct reconnaissance while arousing minimal suspicion. A woman on a bicycle carrying vegetables to market was invisible. A young man in the same situation invited immediate questioning. The SOE began recruiting women in early 1942. The selection process was rigorous and secretive. Potential recruits received anonymous letters asking them to attend interviews at peculiar locations. They were told nothing about the purpose or the organization behind the recruitment. Many assumed they were being evaluated for clerical positions or translation work. Those who passed initial screening faced weeks of assessment. Psychologists evaluated their stability under stress. Linguists tested their language abilities, looking not just for fluency, but for perfect accents and regional dialects. Security officers investigated their backgrounds with extraordinary thoroughness. Any hint of security risk meant immediate rejection. The women who survived this selection process came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Some were British-born women who had lived in France. Others were French citizens who had fled to Britain after the fall of France. Some were married women with children. Others were barely out of their teens. What united them was fluent French, extraordinary courage, and a willingness to risk everything for victory. The training these women received was unlike anything previously offered to female military personnel. At various country houses across Scotland and southern England, the SOE operated specialist training schools. These facilities taught skills that would have seemed absurd or shocking for women in 1942 Britain. Arisaig House in the Scottish Highlands provided paramilitary training. Women learned to fire pistols, rifles, and submachine guns. They practiced hand-to-hand combat, including techniques for silent killing. They learned how to blow up railway lines, destroy fuel dumps, and sabotage factories. They were taught how to live rough, navigate by stars, and survive on minimal rations. At Beaulieu in Hampshire, agents learned the darker skills of espionage. They studied surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. They learned how to follow someone without being noticed and how to recognize when they were being followed. They practiced maintaining cover stories under aggressive questioning. They learned to recognize Gestapo officers, collaborators, and informers. Perhaps most importantly, they learned codes and radio operation. SOE agents in the field depended absolutely on radio contact with London. Messages had to be encrypted, transmitted, and received without error. A single mistake could mean capture. Women spent hours practicing Morse code until they could send and receive at 20 words per minute. They memorized complex encryption systems that had to be applied perfectly every time. The training included one particularly grim session. Instructors explained what capture would mean. The Gestapo did not treat captured spies according to Geneva Convention rules. Female agents could expect interrogation involving torture. The methods were described in clinical detail, so there would be no illusions. Electric shocks, beatings, water torture, and worse. Agents were given a choice. They could carry L-pills, cyanide capsules disguised as buttons, or lipstick cases. If captured and facing torture, they could end their own lives quickly. Every woman who completed training understood the statistics. The average life expectancy of an SOE agent in occupied France was 6 weeks. Some lasted months. Some were caught within days. The odds of survival were poor, and the odds of avoiding capture were worse. Yet when training ended, and the call came for volunteers to deploy into France, the women stepped forward. The first female SOE agents parachuted into France in May 1942. They included Andrée Borel, a young Frenchwoman who had escaped to Britain after helping Allied airmen evade capture. She was 23 years old, spoke perfect French, and had already demonstrated her courage by operating escape lines under German occupation. On the night of the 24th of September, 1942, a Halifax bomber dropped her over the Loire Valley. She landed safely and made contact with the local resistance within hours. Borel's mission was to serve as courier for the Physician Network, one of the largest SOE operations in France. Couriers carried messages between resistance cells, transported weapons and explosives, and scouted targets for sabotage. The work required constant travel through German checkpoints, interaction with potentially compromised contacts, and exposure to denunciation by collaborators. Within weeks, Borel became indispensable to the network's operations. She was joined in January 1943 by Lise de Baissac, who parachuted near Poitiers to establish her own network. De Baissac, a Mauritian of French descent, was 39 years old and had lived across Europe before the war. She spoke French with a Parisian accent and could move through society with confidence that younger agents lacked. Her mission was to establish a network in the Bordeaux region and prepare for sabotage operations targeting submarine facilities. These early female agents proved the concept beyond doubt. They moved through occupied France with relative freedom. They recruited resistance fighters, organized supply drops, and identified targets for sabotage. Their reports back to London provided intelligence that could not be obtained any other way. Most importantly, they demonstrated that women could withstand the psychological pressure of operating alone in enemy territory. By late 1943, nearly 40 British women were operating in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Each had her own cover story, network, and mission. They posed as teachers, seamstresses, shop assistants, and nurses. They lived in safe houses that might be raided at any moment. They carried forged identity papers that might not withstand scrutiny. They transmitted radio messages, knowing that German detector vans were constantly searching for illegal transmissions. The work combined mundane routine with moments of absolute terror. An agent might spend weeks doing nothing more dangerous than carrying messages and observing German movements. Then suddenly, a checkpoint, an unexpected question, or a moment of bad luck could end in arrest. The Germans were not passive opponents. The Gestapo and Abwehr, German military intelligence, devoted enormous resources to identifying and destroying SOE networks. Noor Inayat Khan's story illustrates both the courage of these women and the terrible risks they faced. Khan was an unlikely spy. Born in Moscow to an Indian father and American mother, raised in Paris, she had trained as a musician and children's book author before the war. She was quiet, sensitive, and deeply spiritual. Her SOE instructors considered her unsuitable for field work, noting in reports that she was too gentle and appeared incapable of the deception required for successful espionage. Yet, when the call came for wireless operators in June 1943, Khan volunteered. The SOE needed radio operators desperately. Several networks in France had lost their wireless operators to Gestapo arrests. Without radio contact, these networks could not receive instructions, arrange supply drops, or report intelligence. The need was urgent enough that SOE headquarters overruled the training school's concerns and approved Khan's deployment. On the night of the 16th of June, 1943, Noor Inayat Khan parachuted into France near Le Mans. Her mission was to serve as wireless operator for the Physician Network in Paris. She carried a radio set disguised as a suitcase, crystals for different frequencies, and one-time cipher pads for encoding messages. Her cover story identified her as a children's nurse named Jean-Marie Renier. Khan arrived at the worst possible time. Within 2 weeks of her landing, the Gestapo had arrested most of the Physician Network leadership. The arrests came through betrayal by a network member who had been turned by the Germans. Within a month, nearly the entire network had been rolled up. Khan found herself the only radio operator still at liberty in Paris. London ordered her to return immediately. The network was compromised. She was exposed. Her continued operation endangered both herself and any resistance members she contacted. The standing order for compromised agents was clear: cease operations and make for the emergency escape routes through Spain or Switzerland. Khan refused the order. She transmitted back that Paris still needed a wireless operator. The resistance needed contact with London. She would continue transmitting until replaced or captured. For the next 4 months, Noor Inayat Khan operated as the only link between London and the Paris resistance. She moved locations constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. She transmitted from parks, cafes, and apartments borrowed from sympathetic French civilians. German detector vans followed her signals, triangulating her position. Several times she barely escaped before Gestapo teams arrived. The strain was immense. Khan transmitted almost daily, far more than the recommended maximum. Each transmission increased the risk of detection. She moved her radio set constantly, carrying the heavy equipment across Paris, while avoiding German patrols and checkpoints. She worked from coded messages, encoding and decoding without error, despite exhaustion and fear. Her transmissions coordinated supply drops, reported intelligence on German deployments, and maintained morale among resistance members who otherwise would have felt abandoned. On the 13th of October, 1943, the Gestapo finally caught her. They had been closing in for weeks, tracking her transmissions and questioning informers. The arrest came at an apartment in the 16th arrondissement. Khan was transmitting when they burst through the door. She had seconds to destroy her codes and false identity papers. She chose instead to complete the transmission, ensuring London received the message even as German officers surrounded her. The Gestapo found her radio set still warm, her code books intact, and her identity papers confirming she was a British agent. Khan was taken to Gestapo headquarters at Avenue Foch, the same building where Violette Szabo would later endure interrogation. The interrogators offered her a deal: cooperate, and she would be treated as a prisoner of war. Refuse, and the consequences would be severe. Noor Inayat Khan refused to cooperate. She provided no information about her network, her contacts, or her operations. Under interrogation that became increasingly harsh, she maintained silence or provided false information designed to mislead her captors. After several weeks, the Gestapo classified her as highly dangerous and uncooperative. She was sent to Pforzheim prison in Germany, one of the most secure facilities in the Reich. At Pforzheim, Khan was held in solitary confinement, chained hand and foot. She remained there for 10 months, isolated from other prisoners, denied all communication, kept in a cell barely large enough to lie down. Despite these conditions, she attempted escape twice, each time earning brutal punishment. On the 13th of September, 1944, Khan was transferred to Dachau concentration camp along with 3 other female SOE agents. In the early hours of the 14th of September, 1944, Noor Inayat Khan and the 3 other women were executed by a single shot to the back of the head. Witnesses later testified that Khan's last word was liberté. She was 30 years old. The fate of these captured agents reveals the darkest aspect of SOE operations. The women who were caught faced treatment that exceeded normal bounds of interrogation. The Gestapo recognized captured SOE agents as extraordinarily valuable intelligence sources. Each agent potentially knew other agents, network structures, radio frequencies, and future operations. The Germans devoted enormous effort to extracting this information. Violette Szabo's capture in June 1944 illustrates the progression from arrest to execution. Szabo had been dropped into France on the 5th of April, 1944, her second mission into occupied territory. Her assignment was to coordinate resistance activities in preparation for D-Day. She worked with the salesman network in central France, organizing sabotage operations against railway lines and communication networks. On the 10th of June, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, Szabo was traveling by car with resistance members near Salon-la-Tour when they encountered a German roadblock. The Germans were conducting anti-partisan sweeps in response to increased resistance activity following the Normandy landings. Szabo's group attempted to escape, leading to a firefight. Szabo provided, covering fire with a Sten gun, allowing the French resistance members to escape. She was captured only after running out of ammunition. The Germans recognized immediately that Szabo was not a French civilian. Her clothing, her weapon, and her combat skills identified her as a trained agent. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Limoges for interrogation. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Szabo was beaten, threatened, and tortured. The Gestapo wanted names of resistance members, locations of weapons caches, and details of planned operations. Violette Szabo gave them nothing. Despite torture that left her unable to walk unaided, despite threats of execution, despite offers of leniency if she cooperated, she revealed no information that endangered her network or fellow agents. After 3 days, the Gestapo concluded she would not break. She was sent to Fresnes prison in Paris, then transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. At Ravensbrück, Szabo encountered other female SOE agents who had been captured. The camp held Denise Bloch, Lilian Rolf, and Violette Szabo in a separate section designated for political prisoners and spies. Despite being weakened by interrogation and transport in cattle cars, these women maintained discipline and mutual support. They shared what food they received. They encouraged each other during forced labor assignments. They refused to be broken by their captivity. In late January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Germany from the east, the camp administrators received orders to eliminate certain categories of prisoners to prevent them from being liberated. SOE agents were specifically targeted. On the night of the 26th of January, 1945, Violette Szabo, Denise Bloch, and Lilian Rolf were taken from their cells and marched to an execution area. Each woman was forced to kneel. Each was shot in the back of the head. Violette Szabo was 23 years old. She left behind a 4-year-old daughter who would grow up knowing her mother only through stories and a posthumously awarded George Cross. Not all captured agents met such fates. Odette Sansom survived the war despite enduring some of the worst treatment any SOE agent experienced. Sansom had been operating in southern France when she and her network commander were betrayed to the Gestapo in April 1943. The interrogation that followed was exceptionally brutal. Gestapo interrogators at Fresnes prison tortured Sansom over a period of 14 months. They pulled out her toenails one by one. They burned her back with hot irons. They kept her in a completely dark cell for months. They threatened her with execution on multiple occasions. Throughout this ordeal, Sansom maintained her cover story and revealed nothing of intelligence value. She claimed repeatedly that she was married to her network commander and insisted he was merely following her orders. This fiction, which she maintained despite torture, may have saved her commander's life by convincing the Germans he was less important than they believed. Sansom survived because of a combination of factors. She convinced her captors she was related to Winston Churchill, a complete fabrication that led the Germans to keep her alive as a potential hostage. She was also fortunate in being held at Ravensbrück under the direct authority of the camp commandant, Fritz Suren. As the war ended and Allied forces approached, Suren attempted to save himself by releasing Sansom to American forces, hoping her testimony might mitigate his own war crimes. He was executed anyway, but Sansom survived to testify at war crimes trials and receive the George Cross for her extraordinary courage. The contribution of these female agents to Allied victory was substantial and measurable. In the months before D-Day, SOE networks in France conducted thousands of sabotage operations that disrupted German communications and logistics. Female agents coordinated many of these operations, serving as couriers, organizers, and radio operators. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, the resistance networks that harassed German reinforcements and disrupted communications had been organized and sustained, largely through SOE support. Yvonne Cormeau exemplifies the sustained contribution female agents made. Cormeau parachuted into southern France in August 1943, at age 33, older than most female agents. Her mission was to serve as wireless operator for the Wheelwright network in Gascony. She worked continuously in France for 13 months, one of the longest operational periods of any SOE agent. During those 13 months, Cormeau transmitted over 400 messages to London. She coordinated dozens of supply drops that delivered tons of weapons and explosives to resistance groups. She moved constantly, operating from farmhouses, barns, and fields, always one step ahead of German detector vans. She witnessed Gestapo raids that captured other agents and resistance members. She continued transmitting even when she knew the Germans were closing in. Cormeau survived the war and provided detailed reports on her operations. Her testimony helped historians understand the daily reality of agent work, the constant fear of betrayal, the exhaustion from moving locations every few days, the technical challenges of maintaining radio equipment in the field, the moral weight of recruiting resistance members knowing they might be captured and executed, the isolation from normal human contact, the inability to trust anyone completely. After the war ended in May 1945, Britain faced the challenge of acknowledging the contribution of these agents while maintaining secrecies about SOE operations. The organization was officially dissolved in January 1946. Most of its records were classified or destroyed. The surviving agents were sworn to secrecy. They could not discuss their service publicly, could not reveal details of operations, and could not even acknowledge that SOE had existed. This official silence meant that the women who had risked everything for Britain received minimal public recognition. Some received awards in secret ceremonies. Violette Szabo, Noor Inayat Khan, Odette Sansom, and Yvonne Cormeau eventually received George Crosses, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry. But these awards came years after their service, often posthumously, and without public explanation of what these women had actually done. The families of executed agents spent years uncertain of their loved ones' fates. The government could not confirm deaths or explain circumstances while operations remained classified. Violette Szabo's daughter, Tanya, did not learn the full story of her mother's service and death until the 1950s. Noor Inayat Khan's family knew only that she had died in Germany. The details emerged only gradually as official secrecy relaxed. Beginning in the 1950s, with the publication of several memoirs and official histories, the story of SOE's female agents began to emerge publicly. Odette Sansom's story became a film in 1950, titled Odette, introducing many Britons to the concept of female agents for the first time. The film took significant liberties with the facts, but conveyed the essential truth of these women's courage. Academic historians gained access to SOE files beginning in the 1970s. They discovered that official records had dramatically understated female agents' contributions. Documents revealed networks sustained entirely by women after male agents were captured. They showed female agents conducting sabotage operations that official histories had attributed to male operatives. They documented interrogations where women had protected their networks through courage that exceeded any reasonable expectation. Modern scholarship has identified 50 women sent into France by SOE during the war. 13 died in captivity or were executed. The surviving agents returned to Britain and attempted to resume normal lives. Most married, raised families, and worked in civilian jobs. Few spoke publicly about their wartime service. The Official Secrets Act bound them to silence, and the trauma of their experiences made discussion difficult even with family members. Yvonne Cormeau worked for years in a civilian job without ever mentioning to her colleagues that she had spent 13 months as a secret agent in occupied France. When asked about her war service, she would say vaguely that she had worked for the government. Only in old age did she begin speaking about her experiences, providing interviews to historians, and participating in commemorative events. Nancy Wake, an Australian who served as an SOE agent in France, became one of the most decorated women of the war. She led resistance forces in combat operations, personally killed German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat, and conducted sabotage raids against German installations. After the war, she struggled to adjust to civilian life. In interviews late in her life, she spoke frankly about the difficulty of transitioning from wartime operations to peacetime domesticity. "I had learned to kill," she said in one interview. "Learning to live normally again was harder." The psychological impact of SOE service on surviving agents has been documented through interviews and medical records. Many suffered from what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty trusting others. Some developed problems with alcohol or depression. The combination of traumatic experiences during service and enforced silence after the war created psychological burdens that many carried for life. Yet these women rarely complained or sought attention for their service. When interviewed, they typically minimized their own contributions and emphasized the courage of resistance fighters or other agents. They deflected credit and avoided portraying themselves as heroes. This modesty, combined with official secrecy, meant that for decades, their extraordinary service remained largely unknown to the British public. The contribution of female SOE agents extended beyond their immediate wartime impact. They demonstrated that women could perform at the highest levels in combat operations, intelligence work, and leadership under extreme pressure. They challenged assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. They proved that courage and dedication were not limited by sex. Their service also established precedents for women's roles in intelligence services. After the war, British intelligence agencies began recruiting women for operational roles rather than limiting them to clerical positions. The example of SOE agents demonstrated that women could conduct clandestine operations, withstand interrogation, and make life or death decisions under pressure. This shift in thinking contributed to expanding opportunities for women throughout British security services. Today, memorials commemorate these women's service. A statue of Noor Inayat Khan stands in Gordon Square Gardens in London, depicting her seated with her radio equipment. The memorial was unveiled in 2012, nearly 70 years after her death. The inscription reads, "She gave her life for freedom." A memorial to female SOE agents at Valençay in France lists the names of all women who served in France, including those who died. The Special Forces Club in London maintains a book of remembrance listing all SOE personnel who died in service. Each year, on a date close to VE Day, surviving members and families gather to remember those who did not return. The numbers of survivors diminish each year. Soon, there will be none left who can personally testify to what these operations entailed. Educational programs now teach the story of SOE's female agents as part of Britain's World War II history. School curricula include lessons on secret operations and the role of women in intelligence work. Museums feature exhibits on SOE operations, including displays of the equipment agents used. The radio sets, forged identity papers, L-pills, and other tools of espionage that once were classified are now displayed for public education. The story of Britain's female SOE agents matters because it reveals a dimension of warfare often overlooked. While armies fought conventional battles, These women fought a secret war where victory meant survival and defeat meant torture and death. They volunteered knowing the odds. They served knowing the risks. When captured, they endured treatment designed to break them and refused to break. Their story also reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies remember war. For decades after 1945, Britain preferred to remember its conventional military victories rather than the morally complex world of espionage and sabotage. The story of women parachuting into occupied France, living under false identities, and dying under torture did not fit comfortable narratives about the war. Only gradually has British society come to fully appreciate and honor what these women accomplished. The 13 women who died in German captivity represent only a fraction of the 50 who served. But their deaths illuminate the courage of all who served. When Violette Szabo refused to reveal names despite torture, she protected 37 people who would have been arrested and likely executed. When Noor Inayat Khan continued transmitting, despite knowing she was hunted, she maintained the link between London and the Paris resistance during critical months before D-Day. When Denise Bloch, Lillian Rolfe, and others endured concentration camp conditions without breaking, they protected networks that continued operating until liberation. These women understood that their individual survival mattered less than mission success. They understood that revealing information under torture would lead to the deaths of others. They chose death over betrayal. This choice, made by women barely into their 20s or in their 30s, by wives and mothers and daughters, represents courage of the highest order. The story of Britain's female SOE agents is ultimately a story about the human capacity for extraordinary courage in the service of freedom. These women came from ordinary backgrounds. They had ordinary lives before the war. They were not professional soldiers or trained killers. They were shop girls and teachers and mothers. When their country needed them, they volunteered for service that terrified them. They trained until they were capable. They deployed knowing they might not return. And when the worst happened, when capture and torture came, they proved equal to the test. Their service bought time for the invasion of Europe. Their intelligence contributed to Allied planning. Their sabotage disrupted German operations. Their courage inspired resistance movements and Allied forces alike. And their sacrifice, the 13 who died and the 37 who survived but carried the trauma for life, helped purchase victory in the greatest conflict in human history. Britain sent these women into occupied Europe, knowing some would not return. The women went knowing the risks. They served with distinction. They died with honor. And they deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as the warriors they were. As the number of survivors dwindles and passes into history, it falls to each generation to ensure their story is not forgotten. These women deserve to be remembered alongside any soldiers who fought in conventional battles. Their battlefield was the streets of Paris, the farmhouses of Gascony, the forests of the Loire Valley. Their weapons were radios, forged papers, and unbreakable will. Their enemy was the most brutal regime in modern history. They fought that enemy to a standstill. They protected their networks. They served their country. And when faced with torture and death, they proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The women Churchill sent to die did die, many of them. But they didn't die in vain. They died fighting for freedom, protecting their comrades, and serving Britain at its moment of greatest need. Their story deserves to be told, remembered, and honored for as long as people value courage, sacrifice, and dedication to ideals greater than self-preservation.